When Sultan Suleiman I ascended to the throne of the Ottoman Empire in 1520, the great powers of Europe breathed a collective sigh of relief. His father, Suleiman the Grim, had been a ruthless and terrifying warrior sultan who had spent his reign brutally consolidating power and conquering the Mamluk Empire in Egypt. European diplomats, hearing that the new 26-year-old sultan was a quiet, scholarly, and introspective figure, mistakenly believed that the age of relentless Ottoman expansion was over. They famously quipped, "The lion is dead and a gentle lamb has succeeded him." They could not have been more wrong. Suleiman was no lamb. He was the most fortunate heir in Ottoman history. Unlike his predecessors who often had to fight bloody civil wars against their own brothers to secure the throne, Suleiman was his father's only surviving son. He inherited a vast, stable, and incredibly wealthy empire that stretched across 3 continents, along with a disciplined, battle-hardened army, the most formidable military machine in the world. He had been meticulously trained for this role. As a young prince, he had served as governor in several key provinces, learning the arts of administration and war. He was a man of deep piety and a profound sense of destiny. He saw himself not just as a conqueror, but as the universal sovereign, the caliph of all Muslims and the rightful successor to the Roman Caesars. He was determined to use the immense power he had inherited to expand the abode of Islam, to challenge the Habsburg Emperor for supremacy, and to make his empire a beacon of justice and cultural splendor. Suleiman wasted no time in dispelling any notions of his passivity. His first military objective was the one great obstacle that had defied his illustrious great-grandfather, Mehmed the Conqueror, the formidable fortress city of Belgrade. Known as the gateway to Hungary, Belgrade was the key to Central Europe. In 1521, Suleiman personally led a massive Ottoman army to the city. Using overwhelming numbers and a relentless artillery bombardment, he accomplished what Mehmed could not. The fall of Belgrade sent a shockwave of terror through Christian Europe. The gateway had been smashed open. His next target was the island of Rhodes, the last bastion of the Christian Crusader Knights of St. John in the eastern Mediterranean. These warrior monks were a constant thorn in the side of the Ottomans, their galleys preying on Muslim shipping and pilgrim routes. In 1522, Suleiman descended upon the island with a huge fleet and army. The siege was a long and brutal affair, lasting for 6 months. The knights, led by their heroic Grand Master, put up a ferocious defense. But Suleiman's engineers tunneled under the massive walls, and his janissaries eventually overwhelmed the defenders. In victory, Suleiman displayed the magnanimity that would become a hallmark of his public image. He was so impressed by the courage of his defeated foes that he granted them generous surrender terms. The surviving knights were allowed to leave the island with their arms and treasures, and the remaining inhabitants were promised freedom of worship. The last Crusader state in the East was gone. Suleiman was now the undisputed master of the eastern Mediterranean. With the Balkans and the sea secure, Suleiman turned his attention to the grand prize, the Kingdom of Hungary, the last major buffer state between his empire and the heart of Christian Europe. The Holy Roman Empire ruled by his great rival, the Habsburg Emperor Charles V. In 1526, Suleiman led a colossal army of perhaps 100,000 men into the plains of Hungary. The young and rash King Louis II of Hungary, against the advice of his older counselors, decided to meet the Ottoman force in an open pitched battle on a marshy field near the town of Mohacs. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. The Battle of Mohacs was not a battle, it was a slaughter. The elite, heavily armored Hungarian knights charged bravely, but they were no match for the disciplined Ottoman infantry and the devastating firepower of the Ottoman artillery, which was chained together to form a formidable line of defense. The Hungarian army was annihilated in less than 2 hours. King Louis himself was killed, drowning in a stream as he fled the battlefield. The victory at Mohacs effectively destroyed the independent kingdom of Hungary. Suleiman marched unopposed to the capital of Buda, which he occupied without a fight. Though he would not annex the entire kingdom at this time, he had shattered a major European power and now stood on the very doorstep of the Habsburg domains. The road to Vienna, the imperial capital, was now open. The Sultan's ambition was no longer regional, it was continental. He was coming for the heart of Christendom. The fall of Hungary sent a tidal wave of panic across Europe. The Ottoman threat was no longer a distant problem in the Balkans. It was a clear and present danger to the German heartland. In 1529, Suleiman decided to press his advantage and strike at the very seat of his great rival, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. He assembled another massive army and marched on the imperial capital of Vienna. This, however, would be the high water mark of his European conquests. The campaign was plagued by problems from the start. Unusually heavy spring rains turned the roads of the Balkans into a quagmire, slowing the army's advance and forcing Suleiman to leave behind his heaviest siege cannons. By the time the Ottoman army, exhausted and soaked, arrived at Vienna in late September, the campaigning season was almost over, and the city had been heavily reinforced. The Viennese, commanded by a veteran German mercenary, put up a ferocious defense. The Ottomans, lacking their super-heavy artillery, were forced to rely on mining to try and breach the walls, a slow and costly process. After several weeks of fruitless assaults and with winter setting in, Suleiman, his army racked with sickness, and short on supplies, was forced to make a difficult decision. He abandoned the siege and began the long, miserable retreat back to Istanbul. Though it was a failure, the siege of Vienna was a profound psychological event. The Sultan's armies had stood at the gates of one of Europe's most important capitals. For the next century and a half, the Turkish menace would haunt the dreams of Central Europe. Suleiman had reached the limit of his expansion, but he had firmly established the Ottoman Empire as a dominant and terrifying player in the European balance of power, while known in the West as the Magnificent for his military prowess within his own empire. Suleiman was known by a different, more revered title, Kanuni, the Lawgiver. Suleiman saw himself not just as a conqueror, but as a just ruler, a caliph who dispensed perfect Islamic justice. His most enduring legacy was his comprehensive reform of the Ottoman legal system. He did not change the sacred Islamic law, the Sharia, but he issued a vast new body of secular law known as the canons. This code standardized laws and administrative practices across the vast multi-ethnic empire. It covered everything from criminal law and land tenure to taxation and the treatment of Christian and Jewish subjects, dhimmis. He streamlined the bureaucracy, cracked down on corruption, and created a more just and predictable system of governance. For a time, the Ottoman Empire under his laws was one of the most orderly, well-administered, and meritocratic states in the world. This golden age of justice and administration was matched by a golden age of art and architecture. Suleiman was a magnificent patron, determined to make his capital, Istanbul, the most splendid city on earth. He commissioned a series of breathtaking mosques, bridges, aqueducts, and public buildings. His chief imperial architect was the legendary Mimar Sinan, a genius who would define the classical Ottoman architectural style. His masterpiece, the Suleimani Mosque, still dominates the skyline of Istanbul today. It is more than just a place of worship. It is a vast complex that included schools, a hospital, and a public bath, a testament to the Sultan's piety and his commitment to the public good. In a life defined by public duty and imperial grandeur, Suleiman's private life was a source of unprecedented scandal and political intrigue. The cause was a woman who would become one of the most powerful and controversial in Ottoman history, Hurrem Sultan. Known in the West as Roxolana, she entered the imperial harem as a slave, likely captured from the plains of modern-day Ukraine. She was not a classical beauty, but she was intelligent, charming, and possessed an iron will. She completely captivated the Sultan. In a stunning break with centuries of Ottoman tradition, Suleiman not only made this foreign slave his favorite concubine but also his legal wife. He freed her and married her, an act that shocked the court. Roxolana was not content to be just a wife. She became Suleiman's closest political advisor and confidant, a position of unparalleled influence for a woman. But to secure her power and, most importantly, the future of her own sons, she had to eliminate her rivals. Her primary target was Suleiman's brilliant and popular eldest son, Mustafa, the product of another concubine and the presumed heir to the throne. Through a series of brilliant and ruthless maneuvers, she and her son-in-law, the Grand Vizier Rustam Pasha, convinced the aging Sultan that Mustafa was plotting to overthrow him. In 1553, Suleiman summoned Mustafa to his tent during a campaign and had him strangled by deaf-mute executioners as he watched from behind a screen. The execution of the popular prince caused a scandal and cemented Roxolana's reputation as a cunning and ruthless political operator. The latter years of Suleiman's reign were marked by personal tragedy and the strains of constant warfare. The loss of his beloved Roxolana, followed by a bloody civil war between his two remaining sons, left the old Sultan a weary and somber figure. Yet even in his 70s, his sense of duty remained. In 1566, at the age of 71, and so racked with gout that he had to be carried in a litter, the old Sultan embarked on one last campaign. He led his army north into Hungary one more time to besiege the fortress of Shigeffer. It was during this long and difficult siege, just one day before the fortress was about to fall, that Suleiman the Magnificent died in his tent. His Grand Vizier, fearing that the news would cause the army to lose heart, kept the Sultan's death a secret for over a month. He had the Sultan's personal physician strangled to ensure his silence, and issued orders and proclamations in the dead Sultan's name. The Ottoman army captured Shigeffer and only began the long march home after the campaign was successfully concluded. It was only when they were near Istanbul that the army was finally told that the great Sultan, the Lawgiver, the Magnificent, was dead. Suleiman left behind an empire at its absolute zenith. He had ruled for 46 years, longer than any other sultan, and had personally led his armies on 13 major campaigns. He had expanded the empire's borders to their greatest extent, from the gates of Vienna to the shores of the Indian Ocean. His fleets, under the command of the famed Admiral Barbarossa, had dominated the Mediterranean. His capital was a jewel of art and architecture, and his laws would shape the empire for centuries to come. He was the last of the great warrior sultans, who had been raised as provincial governors and had won their throne through experience. His successors would be raised in the gilded cage of the palace harem, a practice that would contribute to a long, slow decline in the quality of Ottoman leadership. After Suleiman, the empire would never again reach the same heights of power, prestige, and cultural brilliance. He was the embodiment of the Ottoman Golden Age, a true Renaissance monarch, whose reign of magnificence and justice would forever stand as the high-water mark of one of the world's greatest empires.